Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Founding Father, a Biographical Trilogy of Haim Weizmann. My name is Naomi Reinharz, and I am the Chief Development Officer of the America-Israel Friendship League. We have many people watching today from all over the world, so please write in the chat, either on Zoom or on Facebook Live, where you're calling in from or watching from. And also, given today's topic, please write what you think of when you hear the name Haim Weizmann. We here at AIFL launched our Friends Indeed webinar series back in March, and for 8 months now, we have been planning and hosting webinars every Sunday and Wednesday at noon Eastern Time, featuring Israelis and Americans on a wide array of topics. Our moderator for today was under the weather, so I'm filling in for her, and I'm delighted to introduce our two distinguished panelists for today. We have Professor Jehuda Reinharz and Professor Motti Golani. Professor Jehuda Reinharz is calling in from outside of Boston. He is the president and CEO of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation. Prior to that, he was the president of Brandeis University for 17 years, as well as a Richard Court Professor of Modern Jewish History there. His field of scholarly interests is modern Jewish history, specifically the history of Zionism, German Jewish history, and various other aspects of European Jewish history. This week, he completed his term as the chairman of the International Board of the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel. His most recent book is the third volume of the biography of Chaim Weizmann, which he co-wrote with our other panelist, Professor Motti Golani of Tel Aviv University. Professor Golani, who's calling in from Israel, is the chair of the Haim Weizmann Institute for the Study of Zionism and Israeli History at Tel Aviv University. He is a historian of the British Mandate and the State of Israel. Professor Golani is also the author of The End of the British Mandate in Palestine, 1948, and Palestine Between Politics and Terror, 1945 to 1947, among other books. He is co-author, as I said, with Professor Jehuda Reinharz of the third volume of the biography of Chaim Weizmann, entitled Founding Father, published just last month in Hebrew. And I am now pleased to turn it over to Professor Reinharz, who will begin our discussion.
Thank you very much. I assume that most people, at least most people I know, don't know much about Chaim Weizmann. They may have known, may know that he had something to do with the Balfour Declaration. They may know that he was president of Israel, maybe. They may know stories here and there about him, but they really don't know why this man is important enough to have a webinar dedicated to him. So I'd like to try in 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, to give you some idea of who Chaim Weizmann was, where did he come from, and what were some of his major accomplishments, and we'll take it from there. So I'll start with some very simple facts about Weizmann. He was born in the Pale of Settlement in a tiny little village called Mottole, to a family of many children, 12 who survived. His mother had 15 kids, 3 died at birth. Studied in a cheder like everybody else did, the one-room teaching establishment. Went to Pinsk, the larger next city, to study chemistry, and from there to Germany. Now, in Pinsk, he already began to get involved in Zionist activities, which took more and more of his time once he moved first to Germany, then to Switzerland, where he also received his PhD in chemistry. He was involved from the start with student organizations, and you can already see a leadership streak in him. The organizations he was involved with, he usually rose or called himself the leader of these organizations, was involved in lots of debates with non-Zionists, anti-Zionists among the student populations, long debates, and so on. But at the same time, continued to work on his chemistry. He saw himself already when his predecessor in the Zionist movement, this is of course in the view of history, his predecessor being Theodor Herzl. When he passed, Weizmann already thought of himself as a potential successor to Herzl. and spoke in exactly those kinds of terms. He was active in the area of Jewish culture together with Martin Buber and others. He actually moved the whole idea of establishment of the Hebrew University already before World War I, raising money, laying some groundwork for the establishment of the university, dealing with people all over Europe, to some extent also in the United States. And then, of course, came World War I. Now, prior to that, in 1904, Weizmann decided that his role, both in the Zionist organization as well as in terms of his possibilities of getting a position in chemistry, had sort of come to a dead end. And in 1904, he moved to England, to be exact, to Manchester, where he received a lowly position at the University of Manchester, working in a dark, abandoned lab at the university. And he began to get involved slowly, at least at first with some distaste with the politics of English Zionism. He was an unusual figure, a European, very heavy accent, Yiddish-Russian accent, but he did well in chemistry and slowly rose in his position, essentially making some discoveries, patents. He was an organic chemist, and he patented many of his discoveries. Weizmann essentially always felt himself, certainly until World War I, he felt himself to be poor. In a certain sense, he did not have a lot of money. And he was hoping that his patents will change all of that. Eventually, and I won't go into how it all happened, he becomes a reader at Manchester. Reader is sort of equivalent to what we call today an associate professor. In other words, he has tenure, but he did not get the professorship that he was hoping for. And but what does happen to him is that he makes some important connections in the period even before World War I. He meets Balfour, who eventually becomes Lord Balfour. He meets Churchill. He meets others. As I said, he's a sort of a curious image in the Zionist organization, even in England. But in England, he brings another aspect of a kind of a Jew they hadn't seen before. A Jew is very proud of his Jewishness, very proud Zionist. As I said before, heavy accent. He doesn't hide any of this. And he makes one very important connection with the editor of the Manchester Guardian, C.P. Scott. And he begins also to form around him a small cadre of loyalists, English Zionists. Eventually, he rises to the position of vice president of the English Zionist Federation. World War I breaks out, and England is at first in a tight spot. It turns out what they needed is a substance called acetone. Now, acetone, and I'll explain in a minute why acetone is important, but acetone until that time was made from the distillation of wood. All the wood in England would have been insufficient to create the acetone that the British needed during the war. Weizmann had come up already before the war with an idea, a patent, of how to create or how to arrive at large substances of acetone without distillation of wood. Distillation of wood, or the making of acetone, is a bacterial fermentation. And he made this bacterial fermentation through the distillation of maize. Acetone is important for the production of cordite. Cordite is a smokeless powder, making it impossible for the enemy to see where the great guns are shooting from or bombarding them with. And it also keeps the barrel somewhat cooler than the usual method of that was used prior to that. In any case, it is something that he discovers before the war, and he patents it. The British are in as I said, in a tight spot. They need it. They can't receive it as they used to before the war from Germany, obviously, or from other countries, and because of the blockade of England. And to make a long story short, it comes to the attention of the Ministry of Munitions in England. Weitzmann gives the patent. He creates the British take over a number of factories, and Weizmann is able to produce as much as 30,000 pounds of acetone a month. That's a huge, huge discovery. Now, the importance of this is not so much a discovery, but the fact that he is seen immediately as an important person in England, and has an opening to all the salons in England. He is a persona grata. Now, he's an unusual person. They've never seen a Jew like this. They were used to the British Jews, who for the most part were elegant, subdued, tried to play by the rules. Weitzmann is very different. As I said before, he's proud, he's open about his Zionism. He uses every opportunity in the salons to talk about Zionism. As I said, they've never met a Jew like this. He tells jokes about Jews. He has absolutely no hesitation. He's open about everything. And he charms the society around him. Of course, think about the following. I mean, here's a guy, he comes to England in 1904. By 1910, he becomes a British citizen. Now, he thinks to himself in the period right before World War I that if somebody would just pay the train fare from Manchester to London and back, he could convince the greatest power in the world, England, to just listen to his ideas about Zionism and give the Zionists a charter. Now, you have to think about the enormity of this idea. A foreigner, really, who comes and thinks that he can do this. Now, of course, he gets very much involved because of his connections, because of C.P. Scott. He gets to know Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, Balfour, and other ministers in the government. And eventually, and again, I can't go into all the details, he is the one who is the main force that leads the war ministry, the government in a sense, to issue the so-called Balfour Declaration. Now, it's not a declaration, it's a letter. It's a letter that is sent from Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild, who is the most representative figure in the sort of Zionist periphery. And what does the Balfour Declaration say? As it became known as the Balfour Declaration, but the Balfour letter, what does it say? It says, and I have it here somewhere, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine, not of Palestine, in Palestine, of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use its best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that it won't affect other citizens, other people living in Palestine, nor Jews living in their countries, etc. So it's a letter. It's a letter the likes of which has been given to many, many other minorities during World War I. By the way, not only by England, also by Germany, by even by the Japanese. Dozens of letters. Think about it. It was given to the Arabs. It was given, not the same letter, a different kind of a letter with the same essence, to Arabs, to Kurds, to Armenians. Whatever happened to that letter, to those letters? They didn't have a Haim Weizmann. Now, Haim Weizmann, why he? I want to talk something about his trajectory. And by the way, I did not mention that along his journey in Manchester, he also married Vera Weitzmann, who became his wife. She was a physician, did not really practice for more than a year or two in Manchester. But that's a whole other story, which I'll be happy to talk about at some other point. Now, Weitzmann, as I said, so here's the Balfour letter. Weizmann's greatest achievement, in my view, or one of his greatest achievements, is that he was able to convince the British for 30 years that this letter was actually a binding document that the British could not do without. That in fact, it would be immoral on the part of the British Empire or England to do away with its obligations to the Zionists via what Weitzmann called it now, a Balfour Declaration. He used the term. And for 30 years, he was able to do this. So let me give you a few examples of Weitzmann's power and power of persuasion, because I see my time is running out. Weitzmann became the head of the Zionist organization in 1920. Until the end of World War II, his power, his position has been challenged by many. This was not an easy task to become a leader in the Jewish organization, a leader in the Zionist organization. And he decides to take on Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis, the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, probably one of the 2 or 3 most important people in the world at the time, Einstein being one of them, decided that the political aspect of Zionism has come to an end, that the only thing that needed to be done in Palestine was economic. And Weitzmann, of course, objects to this. He believes that both have to be done, the economic side, the political side, etc. And so he decides to take Louis Brandeis on his own turf. And so he goes to the Zionist organization's meetings in Cleveland in June of 1921, and he defeats Louis Brandeis. Now, Weitzmann already then understood the power of public relations. What does he do? I know you had a webinar of Einstein. So Einstein plays a role here. He says to Einstein, who was a Zionist at the time, he said to him, listen, I want you to come with me to the United States. I want you to go around with me when I give my talks. Einstein was not a good speaker. Everybody knows that. By the way, neither was Weitzmann. But that's another matter. And he said, look, and Einstein said, well, what am I going to do? I'm not a speaker. He said, you have to do nothing. Just sit here on the stage, look intelligent. I'm going to give my talk. And people just are going to look at you. They're not going to look at me. And they're going to see the most important Jew in the world is sitting there on the stage. It will be a great success. Anyhow, that's exactly what he does. And in fact, he defeats Louis Brandeis on his own turf. That was huge, huge news. In the 1930s, Weitzmann, by the way, I have to say one other thing because it's relevant. Naomi, if I can say a few more words. Weitzmann hears while he's in England that Herbert Samuel, the first High Commissioner for Palestine, is about to make some deal, or he thought he was making a deal with the Bedouins in Transjordan. He takes the first boat home and he calls up Balfour, who's Foreign Secretary, and he says to him, I want to meet with you and tomorrow morning, and I want the following people to be in the room. Now imagine this, the chutzpah of anybody, never mind, to say to the foreign minister, I want you in that room with the following members of the cabinet, as well as the following other people who are going to come with you. And Balfour says, okay, so who comes there? The Prime Minister of England, Lloyd George, shows up, and all kinds of other ministers, including Churchill, who's the Minister for the Colonies. And Weitzmann does something that is unheard of in British policy, in British politics. he berates Churchill in front of his superior, namely Lloyd George. And he berates Herbert Samuel, whose superior is Churchill. I mean, this is transgressing against all rules. What am I going to say with this? And we can give you many examples of this. Weitzman was able to persuade ministers and prime ministers throughout the 1920s and 1930s, going even into the early 1930s. And he does this a number of times. He does this in 1921. He does it in the 1930s and a number of times, 1928. And by the way, he has no problem when he thinks it's the right thing to do. He yells at them. He speaks to them in harsh terms, and they take it. And in fact, they listen. So I'll just end with one anecdote, because I can go on, and but my time is up. In 1922, in October of 1922, an article appeared in an important paper called the Daily Express in London, which has as its title, Mystery of the Great Haim. Obviously, we're talking about Haim Weizmann, with a picture, by the way, of Weitzman on the front page. And what does it say? It says, who is this man of mystery? What is he doing? This guy controls British politics. He's the one who has lured us into the morass of Palestine. And he's going to continue leading us until we sink up to the neck in irretrievable disaster. He's a guy who is able to take our simple British politicians and draw circles around them. What it shows you here is the following, and I'll end with that. But in 1914, Weitzman is unknown in England. I'm talking about England, English politics. By 1922, there's no one who doesn't know him. The fact that the Daily Express can have this kind of an article about Weitzman, that shows you what position he is in fact arrived at. There was nothing that Weitzman did not know through his contacts that was going on in the parliament, in the war ministry, in the most secret kinds of conversations. He always had people who informed him. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. That was so informative. And just so you know, we're getting so many questions and comments in the chat already. I'll be compiling them, and we'll have some time for Q&A later on. But just quickly before we turn over to Professor Golani, you mentioned the fact that the Balfour Declaration was actually not a declaration, but rather a letter, which I hadn't heard before, and I think most people don't know that. So can you just briefly explain when it and how it turned from a letter into what we now deem it to be a declaration?
Well, people used at the time, 1917, the term declaration, but it was just a word. Weizmann was the one who made this letter, as Professor Reinharz said, a declaration. Actually, the first step was his journey to Palestine in 1918 to tell General Allenby, who, you know, the commander of the British Army there, that there is a letter from Balfour to Lord Rothschild speaking about the Jewish route from national home. And he used, Weitzman, again and again, the term declaration. And it became a term that everybody used it. I mean, one thing is to write declaration. Another thing is to use it again and again. And much important event was the fact that Weitzman pushed the Balfour Declaration into the mandate that the Zionist movement, the British, got from the League of Nations in 1920, which it made it an official international document, actually.
Thank you for that. So now, if you can elaborate a little bit, in your book, which came out last month, you say that without Chaim Weizmann, there would be no state of Israel today. Can you sort of go into a little bit about why you say that and what that means?
Okay, I can try, and maybe Professor Reinharz would like to add. You heard just now, you know, Weizmann's special connection and influence in London, especially in the parliament, in both sides of the House and in the government itself. In 1920, I just said, the British got the mandate from the League of the Nations, but in the same time, Weizmann became the president of the World Zionist Organization. And he was there to explain to the British government again and again that Balfour Declaration, it's not a Zionist interest, actually it's a British one. And they believed him. And he kept to say it until 1939, and it gave the Zionist people in Palestine a chance to build a wonderful basic for a state in less than 30 years. Or let's make it clearer. Just imagine, let's say, a greenhouse. The Zionist-British alliance, actually Weitzman alliance, was like a greenhouse for the Yeshuv in Palestine when they went from just informal community to a formal state. So Weizmann was there to not to say the British, well, look, it's your business to take care in Palestine, but to look on the extremists in the Zionist camp and see that they are not destroy or hurt the Zionist-British alliance. So Weizmann was there, and he kept this greenhouse in this critic 30 years.
Yeah, Weitzmann understood that, just to continue. Weitzmann understood that the process of creating a viable Jewish community in Palestine was not by being in Palestine. He understood that you had to do this from London, and you had to do it from the United States. By the way, Weitzmann met every president of the United States from Wilson on, every single one. Now you ask yourself, how did this minor kind of leader of a movement, which is a very minor movement, Zionism was an esoteric movement. There are many movements in the Jewish community much more important than that. But he takes it and makes it a lot of what we have to be clear about this. A lot of what Weitzmann does is a combination of moral certainty, a certain amount of actually chutzpah, bluff. He writes a letter to Churchill in 1921. He says, I have it here. He says to him, my constituency extends from Singapore to San Francisco. Now, he just made it up. What do you mean his constituency? 3 Jews here, 5 there, and they don't even support Zionism as far as he knows. But his ability to do this in a convincing manner, it goes back to the other letters that other minorities received. Where are they today? Or where were they at that time? None of these letters were fulfilled by Britain or any other power. So Weitzmann really, when it goes back to what we started with. When you talk about, if I were to speak to anybody on the street, even in Israel, and I would say to him, and Motti and I have had this experience, if I were to say to somebody, who created the Jewish state? Who created Israel? You'll have a few names. You'll have Herzl, you'll have Ben Gurion. Some people may say Jabotinsky, but Weitzmann, never. The ignorance of who Weitzmann was is just incredible. Part of it has to do with the fact that he really was not in Palestine. Part of it is that he didn't create a political party. There are lots of reasons. But the fact is that he is the only one who had access to power. And by the way, not only in London and in America. When he wanted to see Mussolini, he saw Mussolini. Saw him 4 times. When he wanted to see the president of France, he saw the president of France. His personal power, which is really, and his knowledge of politics, his understanding, his fearlessness as a diplomat, as a strong believer, and as Motti said, the fact that he is both British and Zionist. He feels himself as a British subject. totally loyal to England, but also loyal to Zionism. And that combination was unbeatable.
Naomi, if I may add, I mean, we both, Yehuda and me, we understand that Weizmann is not the only reason for the establishment of the state of Israel. Of course, you need a bunch of vectors, a bunch of reasons in order to have it. But just imagine again, like a car engine, and one element doesn't work, so it's not working at all. And this is Weizmann. Weizmann was there, and it couldn't work without him, no doubt about it.
You know, I'll say one more word, and then I'll let you ask the questions. I think that, just to complete the story, along the way, Weitzmann, of course, created many things. He created the Jewish Agency and other institutions. But you have to imagine the following. This, as I said before, his leadership of the Zionist movement was always challenged by somebody or some people. And he was ousted from the Zionist leadership in 1930 and again after World War II. So, but still, even then, even after he was ousted, he was the one who had access to Truman. No one else did. He was able to get to Truman. And Truman at first was reluctant, but finally was charmed by Weizmann. Right behind me is a picture of Weizmann and Truman, which Naomi actually gave me, that shows Weizmann giving Truman a Torah scroll. And because of that relationship, the United States eventually recognized the state of Israel. Because of Weizmann, they also received the Negev as part of the state, a very large loan to the new Jewish state. Actually, I don't know if it was ever paid back, Motti. And I think that's the power of the man. At a time, again, I'm going to ask apology of all the Ben Gurion fans, when Ben Gurion could not even get into the State Department because he couldn't get an audience. That's the power of the man.
You just mentioned Ben Gurion, who obviously was the first prime minister of the state of Israel. We have a question from the audience about what Haim Weizmann's relationship was with Ben Gurion, as well as with his nephew, Ezer Weizmann, who was also a president of the state of Israel later on. Why is, Ben Gurion so well known among, the vast majority, I would say, of diaspora Jews and probably Israelis, and why is Haim Weizmann not so well known among them?
I'll just say one sentence, and I'm going to turn it over to Motti. Motti and I like to say that Weizmann and Ben Gurion had one thing in common. They both admired Weizmann. But Weizmann had no use for Ben Gurion, and for all kinds of reasons, but then I'll let Motti speak.
Well, it's quite strange why people, is speaking about the Israeli collective memory. Yeah, it's true that many people have no idea about Weizmann. I think that the main reason is that Weizmann led the people of Israel, let's say, like Moshe, to the promised land, and then remain on Nebo mountain. And David Ben Gurion, actually, Yoshua Ben Nun, took the lead from Weizmann. And then we have an independent states. Actually, this was the end of the World Zionist movement. It became something else. And the Israeli look around and looking on Weizmann, and it doesn't fit with whom they believe they are. They needed a different hero, like Ben Gurion, like, let's say, Moshe Dayan. Weizmann was an old style. He represent an old era. So he was forgotten, actually. And what we are doing in our new book is to make it, to make this story alive again, actually.
We have a question from Shoshana, who mentioned that Einstein was actually asked to be president of Israel before Weizmann. And why did Einstein not become president? Why did Weizmann?
No. Opposite. Weitzman, first of all, he never wanted to be Israeli president, but after Weizmann died in November 1952, the Israeli government, Ben Gurion actually, offered the job to Einstein. And fortunately, he refused. I mean, fortunately for the Israeli government and for his land. That was after Weitzman, not before.
You know, Einstein, I know I'm referring again to the panel you already had, but Einstein was a difficult person. And in every organization that he was involved in, eventually he walked away in anger or had disputes. He was with Weitzman on the board of the Hebrew University in the 1920s. He fought with everybody. By the way, he was also in a group that helped create the university I led, Brandeis University. And there too, something displeased him. I mean, I have a picture of the trustees coming to visit him. All was good, but soon after that, something turned him off and he walked away. Eventually, I mean, originally they were actually thinking of calling the university Einstein, but that's another matter. So as Motti says, lucky for Israel that he did not lead. He was just a complicated individual.
You mentioned
brilliant, obviously, but you don't need this from me.
You mentioned his chutzpah earlier, which allowed him to get into a lot of venues that others did not get into. And I know that you speak in your book a lot about his personal character traits. And can you elaborate a little bit more about his personal life, which I know is of interest to you, and what other character traits did he have? Why was he such a complicated individual, like you said?
Weitzman was a human being, like all of us. Probably in my view and Motti's view, I'm sure, one of the greatest figures in Jewish history, but a human being. And and by the way, and what we wrote is a biography. It's not a political biography, it's not a social biography, it's a biography. Biography means that all the elements of the person, what makes him tick, is there, including his relationship within the family, which were very difficult, very cold relationship with his wife. And at the same time, they were dependent on each other, difficult relationship with his children. One of whom died during the war as a pilot, and one who survived and had very difficult relations with him. And Weitzman had, you can't call them even affairs, but he loved the company of both women and men. He needed people all the time. He thrived on the contact with people. And with women, he had a very interesting way of getting to get them involved with him. He loved to talk about his illnesses, and of which there were many, and they resonated to this. It was just a way for him to communicate with them, among other things. I'm exaggerating here. So he needed people around him. As I said, the family life was difficult. He was away most of the time, sometimes for months on end. At one point, he was in the United States. Motti, correct me, I think for something like 11 months. And of course, it was difficult. It was difficult for Vera Weitzman. It was difficult for his children. As one of his children, Benji, said, you may have a home for the Jewish people, but we don't have a home. Right here in England, so something like that. So a man like all of us, complicated and brilliant at the same time.
And I think that his tragedy, and I fully agree with Yehuda, that he gave up everything, gave up his professional career. He damaged his health. He gave up actually on his family, everything for Zionism. And because he was so, he was like all of us, it's a very complicated story, especially for his family. And we don't hide it. We talk about it in our book.
One of the follow-up questions I'm getting is what happened to Weizmann's children? You know, did his children follow in his path? Did he choose a successor for himself? Why didn't they go on to have roles in politics like him?
Well, their favorite child, one can say, of his two sons was Michael, who became a pilot during World War II, and whose plane was shot down over France. He was never found. He knew how to get along with his parents, in a sense, because he knew how to maneuver them. Benji, the older one, that's the complicated part or more complicated part of the story. He was a very gifted linguist, but his father and mother insisted that he become a scientist, and he was miserable. He couldn't stand it. And he failed, of course, as a scientist, and eventually he became totally disaffected. He also drank a lot. He married twice, and had no use for the Zionist movement. He wasn't part of that. By the way, they were raised by a nurse, a non-Jewish nurse, in their home. By the way, they became very wealthy after Weitzman became very wealthy after World War I because of a byproduct of acetone that was important for the lacquer on cars, and the car industry was just taking off at the time. He sold his patent to a company in Terre Haute, Indiana. And as I said, became very well. So they lived in a grand style, and they had a nurse. They called her a nurse who took care of the kids, and that was a difficult relationship for the children.
Another question I'm getting is, he was perceived by some as the king of the Jews, and I don't know if that was his naming of himself or others' naming of him. But many revered him, obviously, but he also had many enemies and many skeptics around the world, both in government, in the media, and elsewhere. Can you talk a little bit about his enemies and those who disagreed with his views and with his actions?
Motti, you want to take this?
Well, I think that, we can speak about his major enemy, inside the Zionist movement was actually a very close friend of him. Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky, the head of the revisionist party. Jabotinsky was like Weizmann, very intelligent, very well spoken. Weizmann in many ways liked him very much and hated him at the same time, because Jabotinsky was the one who could see what Weizmann really doing. He understood him, he knew him very well. And if someone, I think, could risk Weizmann as a leader, it's not Ben Gurion, it's Jabotinsky, especially until 1934, 35, when he went out of the Zionist world movement, and he died actually in 1940. But Jabotinsky is the real story speaking about enemy. Outside the Zionist, they're not movement, If you look on, on the Jewish enemies and the Zionist enemies, they all was there. Weizmann was one of the first who spoke against the Nazi party in the 30s. He insisted that Mein Kampf will be translated fully into English, that the people can see who is Hitler. And there was a saying or a joke, I don't know, in England during the Second World War, that the second a man who will hang by the Nazis, if they will occupy Britain, will be Haim Weizmann.
I agree with what Motti says. I will just add one thing. Unlike Ben Gurion, Weizmann had a lot of respect for Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was brilliant. In many, many ways. He was not a man of action, but he was brilliant. He couldn't do what Weizmann did, and Weizmann couldn't do what he did. And highly educated, multilingual, etc. For a while, during World War I, they lived together. They lived in the same apartment in London. But I have another theory, which actually I've never tested with you, Motti, but because it doesn't belong in our book. Vera liked Jabotinsky, and Jabotinsky liked Vera. Now, I don't know if that had something to do with the conflict between them. I'm saying it somewhat facetiously, probably not, but there was something there, and Weitzman had respect for Jabotinsky. He did not dismiss him. In fact, he took him, as Motti says, as one of the most dangerous opponents of his, who eventually split from the Zionist movement, created his own splinter movement. So very different situation from other enemies of Weizmann's. And by the way, Weitzman had a very clear methodology. He never created a party, as I mentioned before. He had a group of people around him who were yes men and women. And he had a couple of people he totally trusted with, the niece of Balfour, Blanche Dugdale, and his secretary. But Weitzman, because he was wealthy, was not dependent on the Zionist movement. He was an independent actor. He acted independently, which really ticked off a lot of people, a lot of times. And even in his approach to England during World War I, I mean, he didn't pay attention to what the Russian Zionists were saying or doing. So he was really the kind of person that, as long as you adhere to his policies, as long as you supported him, you were part of the inner circle. The moment you stepped outside that circle, you were finished, and sometimes finished for good.
And I would like a little story about the end of Weizmann-Jabotinsky relationship. You know, Jabotinsky died in New York in August 1940, and Weizmann was there, and he came in for the Shiva. And in the moment Johanna, the widow, saw him, she insisted that he will leave immediately, and he left.
Another question we're getting is Weizmann's relationship with another, towering figure in Zionism, of course, Theodor Herzl, who a lot of people, know as the founder of Zionism. What was the relationship between the two of them?
Complicated. Weizmann was already a very minor leader in the Russian Zionist enclave, but still under the if you like, under the power of the more established Zionists in Russia, people like Chlenov, Sokolov, and others, and he created a youth group called the Democratic Faction that opposed Herzl. First of all, opposed him also on the Uganda project. Herzl wanted at some point, he saw Uganda, it was really East Africa, as what was called at the time as a Nacht Asyl, as a temporary shelter. And Weitzman, by the way, initially was sort of supportive of the idea until he realized that his elders in the Russian Zionist movement would really be quite upset with him, and so he changed course. The Democratic Faction was a really opposition, but a loyal opposition to Weitzman. In other words, they did not secede from the movement, but also he had great admiration for Herzl. Herzl is really his predecessor, not anybody else, and he saw himself, as I mentioned before, as sort of the next Weitzman. Saw himself as sort of the next. When Herzl died, he wrote a letter to someone. He said, a great burden has now fallen on my shoulders. It shows you what he was thinking already all the way back in 1904.
Thank you. We mentioned earlier that you just completed your term as the international chair of the Weitzman Institute. We're getting a lot of questions about when and how the Weitzman Institute was created, and the fact of its creation shows that people recognized Weitzman at the time as someone important to name an institute after. So can you explain the history and the purpose of that institution?
Well, the institution was created in 1934. It was called the Ziv Institute. It was not called the Weizmann Institute. It was named after the son of a close friend of Weitzman, a son who committed suicide, but was interested in the sciences. And Weitzman came up with this idea. Now, prior to that, there's a long history, which will take us a long time to explain, of a very difficult relationship of Weitzman with the Hebrew University, which he helped create, and in fact was the president. The president meaning a non-executive president of the Hebrew University. There was a chancellor. His name was Jehuda Magnus. And both Weitzman and Einstein for a while collaborated together, trying to not necessarily oust Magnus, but to cut his wings. Lots of conflicts there all the time. Weitzman actually, for a time, wanted to teach at the Hebrew University. They wouldn't let him. So you can imagine, here's a chemist, he's the president of this organization. They won't let him. And by the way, Weitzman already stopped being a chemist after World War I. He stopped chemistry. I mean, once in a while, he dabbled in chemistry, but that was pretty much the end. World War I was the end of that. So part of the creation of and there's a long prehistory to this, which I won't go into, was to create his own organization, his own research center. This is what it was originally, in Rehovot, as part of an agricultural establishment that was there, and away from Jerusalem, away from the Hebrew University. That was one of the strong motivations for Weitzman. Eventually, as we're talking about 1934, Hitler is already on the scene. Weitzman also wanted to bring scientists who were kicked out of their positions in Europe to this center. He did not succeed, except with one, whose name is Bergman, and who eventually became a very important part of the institute. But that's the beginning of what became eventually the Weizmann Institute. Was named for Weitzman, I believe, Motti, on his 70th birthday.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. I will add that speaking about the end of it, in 1949, when Ziv Institute became Weizmann Institute, he was the president of Israel already, weak mentally and physically. And, the science was always second to the main thing, to Zionism. And suddenly he felt that he had nothing, no Zionist movement anymore. His position in the state of Israel was quite weak. So what remained is the Weizmann Institute. And unlike all his life, at the very end of his life, he emphasized suddenly the science and the Weizmann Institute and put it in the first place. But some people who start at the end may take it wrong, because science was not a Weizmann desire. It was just a tool for the main things.
Interesting. I see we have only a few minutes left for our Q&A, and we have way too many questions to answer during this time. So let me ask one final question for our panelists. If you could explain what led you to study and devote so much time to Weitzman, whether it's 3, books or 1 book to Weitzman and many years, what led you to research him in the first place? What was perhaps the most interesting or surprising thing you've learned about him over this time?
Well, I suppose I started the project earlier than Motti. I fell into it. It was not something that I had planned on. I had read Weitzman's autobiography, Trial and Error. I thought it was a great book, well written, beautifully told. By the way, he didn't write it all by himself, but that's another matter. And I fell into it. It's a long story. In 1975, I was asked by a good friend of mine to get involved in this, etc. Anyhow, I ended up starting the project. Why did I start the project? Because I had already edited one of the volumes of letters of Weitzman. There are 23 volumes of his letters. The Weitzman Archives has about 25,000 letters that Weitzman wrote. He was an unbelievably industrious letter writer. He could write as many as 25 letters a day. We're talking about before Zoom, before Facebook, before all these other, even before phones were readily available. And of course, the post office was much more efficient than it is today. You could actually get a response to your letter the same day. I mean, amazing. So I fell into it, really, in a sense. I had no idea how great. I mean, I also grew up, I was born in Israel. I also grew up on Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion created the state, Ben Gurion created everything. Yes, I knew Weizmann had been president of Israel. I didn't even know about the Balfour Declaration until much later in my life. And but what we discovered is what we just talked about for the last hour. I mean, everything about this man is surprising. The fact that, as Motti mentioned before, a man who sacrificed everything for the Zionist cause, his family, his chemistry, in many cases his friends, and yet a man who had so many other sides to him, so everything about Weitzmann is surprising. What is most surprising is that one man can have that kind of an impact in history. That sort of justifies the theory of the person in history. You know, are the circumstances what make history, or is it the individual who makes the difference? I think in the case of Weitzmann, what is absolutely clear to me, and I think to Motti too, this is an individual who understood history, understood how to act, when to act, seized the moment, and I think brought us to a point after World War II from which Ben Gurion and all the others who have done also amazing things to make sure that Israel remains a safe and strong country. Without Weitzmann, they wouldn't have been there. And I guess that for me was the most surprising thing, what one man can do in history.
Why Weitzmann? You know, the short answer is Jehuda. And a longer one, also very short, you know, I think it was 2008, I had a radio interview in Israel, and I was asked, would you like to eat breakfast with one of the Israeli leaders? And I didn't think that I answered Haim Weizmann. It was strange because at the time I worked on Moshe Dayan biography. And then, I don't know how it happened, like 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, I had a call from Yehuda asking me to join the project. Weizmann biography. So both events told me that Weizmann is the one. And I think it's the main reason I went on Weizmann is the fact that I realized that in order to understand the Zionist or the Israeli history, you have to learn it from outside rather than from inside. It's a different story. And I think the right story of the history of Israel. So thank you, Yehuda.
Well, we've worked together for 12 years. By the way, we had done another book beforehand on a remarkable woman called Manya Shochat. So I knew what I was getting into with Motti, and we worked for 12 years, and we almost never disagree, and it's been just a wonderful relationship.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, you know, the questions are pouring in, and sorry to all those that we couldn't answer, but you know, thank you so much for both of you for this amazing hour. I learned a lot, even growing up with you. I learned a lot more than I did at home in this really informative hour. So thank you for that. And again, this is part of our Friends Indeed webinar series, which we've been holding every Wednesday and Sunday at noon Eastern time. We have audience members from around the world, including today. I'm seeing names from really all across the US and Israel and many other countries. So thank you all for your time and your questions and your enthusiasm for this topic. For those of you who are interested, you can sign up for our email list, and you can follow us across all social media. All of our webinars are free, and please share them with your friends and family as well. The next webinar in our series will be this Wednesday, again at noon Eastern, November 25th, entitled Multi-Faith and Gratitude, How Do We Give Thanks? Just in time for Thanksgiving. And for those of you who are getting many questions about how to access this webinar, we do offer all of them on YouTube and on our website afterwards for you to share and watch as many times as you would like. So thank you for joining us today. We can't do these webinars without your help. For those who are able to, please think about offering a donation to us on our website or connect with me directly. We really appreciate your support. Again, it means a lot to us. We can't do it without you. In the spirit of Thanksgiving, I want to give thanks to our panelists, our viewers, and our supporters around the world. And thanks again for watching. Have a great week. Take care, everyone.